All right, good morning. Welcome back. I hope you are all safe and dry. I'm sorry that you had to come to school on Tuesday, only to have your day dismissed in the middle of the day. They should have canceled classes altogether. My property class starts at 12:20, and they cancel class at 12:13. So basically, I was walking to class, and then they canceled it. So it's very frustrating. But at least we got our class, and we don't have to do makeup. Questions? Anything on your minds? All right. Let's do a poll question to refresh where we were last week. It's been a bit of a long break. Okay. Yes?
We had class Tuesday.
Oh my God, I had a mental lapse. You're right, we did. Here we are. Okay. I'm here. We're here. Okay. Indeed. Okay. All right. Well, welcome back anyway. Let's do a question. Talk something I actually know about ConLaw. Calendars I don't know so well. Here's your question. To fall into the first tier of Justice Jackson's framework in Youngstown, Congress must pass a statute that expressly authorizes the president's actions. True or false? All right. So since we did have class on Tuesday, where did I drop off? Where did I finish? Antoine, you next? Or is Martin next? Okay. Okay. I'll take one for the team. All right. Antoine, refresh our memory, right?
Yes, sir.
Why was Justice Jackson writing separately? What was he like trying to get at in Youngstown?
So he was trying to be more flexible in regards to Justice Black's more rigid interpretation.
You guys aren't on time.
I'm sorry. Okay, I have two kids. One of my
okay.
son's autistic, and if you want to discuss it after class, we can. You don't need to publicly shame me. What's his excuse? He's always late. Every class he's late.
All right, Antoine, let's go ahead.
Yes, sir.
So what was Justice Jackson getting at?
Justice Jackson was getting to the point that the Constitution only grants power, but keeps it from getting out of hand.
Okay.
And so he was trying to, he did the zones, so like Zone 3, Zone 1, Zone 2. And so in this situation, it fell into Zone 3 because obviously Congress had not authorized it. And then Congress had not authorized it, and they were obviously against it, so they weren't in the twilight either.
Okay.
And so in this situation, obviously that's why they ruled in Youngstown against the president's executive power.
Okay, very good. The situation in Youngstown was whether Congress had expressly given the president the power to take control of the steel mills. And there was perhaps some question about whether Congress had or hadn't. And Justice Jackson puts together this, this framework which considers what happened. Does the president have his own independent powers as a matter of the Constitution? Does the president have the powers of Congress with respect to a delegation? If you have both, the powers of Congress and the powers of the president, we say we're in the first tier, this first zone. And because you're in this first zone, the executive gets deference, right? Because both of the elected branches are on the same page. All right? But what happens if the president is only relying on his own powers, his own constitutional authority, but not the powers of Congress? In that case, we're in this third zone, right? This third zone. And in this third zone, the courts are skeptical because Congress basically said no, and the president said yes. And then there's this middle region, right, where it's not really clear what the president's powers are. And it's not really clear what the powers are that Congress gave them. And Jackson says we can't really give you a bright line rule for this middle tier. This is the zone of twilight Martin mentioned a minute ago. Okay, so that's the three tiers of the Youngstown framework. Let's go back to our question here. Martin, so my question for you is this. To fall into the first tier of Jackson's framework in Youngstown, Congress must pass a statute that expressly authorizes the president's actions. Is this true or false?
Maybe false.
Okay, why do you say false?
Because it doesn't have to be it can be expressed or implied as well.
Bingo. That's the right answer. Okay? This right here, about 80% got this right. Very good. The answer is false. Jackson says in his opinion it could be either expressly authorized or implied. Now, Martin, I think you gave me a very good answer. Tell me, what does it mean for authorization to be implied?
More likely where they don't really give you an answer, it kind of just the president just goes with it. Congress doesn't really say anything about it, and it just kind of.
Good. Well, Ruben, let me ask you a follow-up. I think Martin's right, but give me an example of like how you imply something, right? What does it mean to imply, just as a general matter?
It's not to express, it's to infer through maybe actions.
Okay, well, just
Suggest.
a pet peeve. Infer and imply are different things. It's a very common mistake, and it's very common, but I imply, meaning I suggest something, and you infer. You understand what I'm implying. So just terminology, it's a pet peeve, right? But I think you're right. If Congress passes a statute that says, we give the president the power to deal with hostage crises. Think of the second case, right? That's not express. It doesn't say that you can maybe suspend bank accounts, suspend these sort of claims. But we say we give Congress the power to deal with the crises of hostages, right? Well, a hostage crisis can take a lot of different forms. A lot of things can happen. And we see in the Dames and Moore case that you have this implied authority, right? It's implied because it's not specific. What is at issue? So when you think about Justice Jackson, the more you think about it, the less helpful it gets. Because it's not only express authority, it's implied. And when you see how Rehnquist ruled in the second case in Dames and Moore, right? You realize that this scope of implied authority can be quite broad. And even if Congress has not spoken on the precise issue at hand, you still might fall in the first tier of Youngstown. And if you fall in the first tier of Youngstown, guess what? The courts are going to be very deferential. They're not going to like say, well, I don't know about this. They're going to be deferential. So the Jackson framework seems probably really cool until you recognize how big the first zone is, right? And the first zone is pretty big. And if you can get yourself into this first zone, you're home free if you're the government. All right, everyone with me? Okay. All right. I want to go a little bit out of order today. I want to do the Japanese detention cases first, and I'll do James and Moore at the end. We'll just flip it. I would flip them in the case book, but it's a long conversation for another time. But we'll just flip it in for our purpose. And I want to start today's class by showing you a video. This is an actual video that was produced by the United States government during the Japanese detention cases. Sorry. This is an actual video this is not like fake. You're going to think it's fake, but this is actually a video the US government produced during World War II. And the purpose of this video was to show people how these camps operated. Back then, there was no TV. So if you wanted to watch the news, you'd actually go to a movie theater, and there'd be these newsreels, right? We'd watch a news clip. So this is about 10 minutes. It's long, but I think it's worthwhile watching. So I'm going to play it, and I'll comment along the way. Everyone can hear it okay?
Became a potential combat zone. Living in that zone were more than 100,000 persons of Japanese ancestry, 2/3 of them American citizens, 1/3 aliens. We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous, but no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores. Military authorities therefore determined that all of them, citizens and aliens alike, would have to move. This picture tells how the mass migration was accomplished. Neither the Army nor the War Relocation Authority relished the idea of taking men, women, and children from their homes, their shops, and their farms. So the military and civilian agencies alike determined to do the job as a democracy should, with real consideration for the people involved. First attention was given to the problems of sabotage and espionage. Now, here at San Francisco, for example, convoys were being made up within sight of possible Axis agents. There were more Japanese in Los Angeles than in any other area. At nearby San Pedro, houses and hotels, occupied almost exclusively by Japanese, were within a stone's throw of a naval airbase, shipyards, oil wells. Japanese fishermen had every opportunity to watch the movement of our ships. Japanese farmers were living close to vital aircraft plants. So as a first step, all Japanese were required to move from critical areas such as these. But of course, this limited evacuation was a solution to only part of the problem. The larger problem, the uncertainty of what would happen among these people in case of a Japanese invasion, still remained. That is why the commanding general of the Western Defense Command determined that all Japanese within the coastal area should move inland. Immediately, the Army began mapping evacuation areas and for a time encouraged the Japanese to leave voluntarily. The trouble for the voluntary evacuees soon threatened in their new locations. So the program was quickly put on a planned and protected basis.
The flyer they have right there.
The American citizen Japanese and Japanese aliens made plans in accordance with orders. Notices were posted. All persons of Japanese descent were required to register. They gathered in their own churches and schools, and the Japanese themselves cheerfully handled the enormous paperwork involved in the migration. Civilian physicians made preliminary medical examinations. Government agencies helped in 100 ways. They helped the evacuees find tenants for their farms. They helped businessmen lease, sell, or store their property.
They had to sell their businesses.
This aid was financed by the government, but quick disposal of property often involved financial sacrifice for the evacuees. Now the actual migration got underway. The Army provided fleets of vans to transport household belongings and buses to move the people to assembly centers. The evacuees cooperated wholeheartedly. The many loyal among them felt that this was a sacrifice they could make in behalf of America's war effort. In small towns as well as large, up and down the coast, the moving continued. Behind them, they left shops and homes they had occupied for many years. Their fishing fleets were impounded and left under guard. Now taken to racetracks and fairgrounds where the Army almost overnight had built assembly centers. They lived here until new pioneer communities could be completed
Pioneer
on lands in the
communities.
Santa Anita Racetrack, for example, suddenly became a community of about 17,000 persons. The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. The residents of the new community set about developing a way of life as nearly normal as possible. They held church services, Protestant, Catholic, and Buddhist. They issued their own newspaper, organized nursery schools, and some made camouflage nets for the United States Army. Meanwhile, in Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, and elsewhere, quarters were being built where they would have an opportunity to work and more space in which to live. When word came that these new homes were ready, the final movement began. At each relocation center, evacuees were met by an advanced contingent of Japanese who had arrived some days earlier and who now acted as guides. Naturally, the newcomers looked about with some curiosity. They were in a new area, on land that was raw, untamed, but full of opportunity. Here they would build schools, educate their children, reclaim the desert.
Reclaim the
Their
desert.
own physicians took precautions to guard against epidemics. They opened advanced Americanization classes for college students, who in turn would instruct other groups. They made a rough beginning at self-government, for while the Army would guard the outer limits of each area, community life and security within were largely up to the Japanese themselves. They immediately saw the need for developing civic leaders. At weekly community meetings, citations were given to the block leaders who had worked most diligently. Special emphasis was put on the health and care of these American children of Japanese descent. Their parents, most of whom are American citizens, and their grandparents, who are aliens, immediately wanted to go to work. At Manzanar, they built a lab house and began rooting guayuli cuttings. The plants, when mature, will add to our rubber supply. At Parker, they undertook the irrigation of fertile desert lands. Meanwhile, in areas away from the coast and under appropriate safeguards, many were permitted to enter private employment, particularly to work in sugar beet fields where labor was badly needed. Now, this brief picture is actually the prologue to a story that is yet to be told. The full story will begin to unfold when the raw lands of the desert turn green, when all adult hands are at productive work on public lands or in private employment. It will be fully told only when circumstances permit the loyal American citizens once again to enjoy the freedom we in this country cherish, and when the disloyal, we hope, have left this country for good. In the meantime, we are setting a standard for the rest of the world.
For the rest of the world.
People who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency. And we won't change this fundamental decency no matter what our enemies do. But of course, we hope most earnestly that our example will influence the Axis powers in their treatment of Americans who fall into their hands.
I play that video every year, and it's a hard thing to watch. It's not an easy thing to watch because this isn't. It's an actual government publication, and this film strip was designed to serve a couple different purposes. One of the purposes was to try to convey to the American people that this was natural and humane and justified. That was the internal purpose. But there was an external purpose as well. At this time, there were prisoner of war camps, not just on our side, but on the other side. The Axis powers, the Germans, had their own prisoner of war camps. And if you notice at the end, they said we are setting a standard for the world. They were trying to show, hey, look, you know, whatever you think about this, we're not like the Nazis, right? We're better than the Nazis. I'm not sure that's a good standard to be comparing to. But this was, how do we put it, not unpopular. This was a move that was largely well accepted among most people at the time. Lots of people involved in the government were actually carrying these orders out to make them sell their businesses, to put them on buses, to transport them to these camps, to actually operate these facilities. This is not like something that happened in secret. It happened fully in the open with cameras. Is that a hand? Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I read that not only did they get, forced to relocate, but when they returned back to their homes and things like that, and a lot of them had owned like businesses and they were, employing other citizens, that their stuff was destroyed. They didn't come back to their house. Like a lot of their fellow community members kind of took this like.
Yeah, they took their stuff. You saw the businesses were kind of boarded up with like their businesses were taken over. When they were sent home, I think they were given, I'm gonna get the dollar figure wrong, it was like $15 or $20 and a bus ticket. The dollar figure, I think I'm off, but it was basically like a couple bucks and a bus ticket. And it's like, okay, go home. This was if you saw in the video, this sign that they were posting on the walls and the poles, and it says, I'll read it if you can't read it. It says, the Western Defense Command, San Francisco, California, instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry living in the following areas, and then lists various areas. Again, these were U.S. citizens. They weren't foreign nationals. Some of them were, to be sure, but a lot of them were U.S. citizens who were either born here or naturalized. And they were required to report to the following area. Now, this is dated May 23rd, and they're required to report basically that same day. So in other words, they had to immediately go to these facilities and register, whatever, what does that mean? They have to acknowledge that, in fact, they are Japanese. How do they know who was Japanese? Well, we had a census. And the census was actually used in part to figure out the households where people might have been of Japanese origin. So again, the thing was posted on May 23rd, and it's hard to read in the bottom, but it says, go there the next day, May 24th. So basically you had like a day to get your stuff together. I'll show you some other pictures. This is a map of where these various camps were located. There were actually a couple facilities here in Texas, but you think, we're on the West Coast. But this entire zone basically shifted pretty far east. Here are some newspapers that were published at the time. And, the headlines weren't like, oh my God, this is awful. It's like, okay, ouster, right? Almost like, good, right? That is something that should be happening. This one always freaks students out. Does anyone recognize these cartoons? It kind of look familiar. Style. Anyone know where it's from? Who drew it?
Is that Dr. Seuss?
Dr. Seuss. Yeah. Dr. Seuss's name was Theodore Gazelle. He was a cartoonist, right? He drew these children books, Cat in the Hat, Green Eggs and Ham. But I want you to see this cartoon, and it says at the top, it's hard to read, it says, waiting for the signal from home. And it shows Washington, Oregon, California, and a line of, stereotypically drawn Japanese people with a sign saying the fifth column, which is basically a reference to spies, espionage. And they're handing out blocks of TNT explosives. This was basically a kid's cartoon, and if you ever Google it, you can go on YouTube. They have like Bugs Bunny cartoons with like basically Japanese. This was, pretty well established. Here's some pictures of the various camps. This is the Topaz camp where Korematsu was sent. The floors are made out of dirt. The camp they showed on TV looked pretty nice, I guess. It's all nice and clean. That was for show, right? It wasn't real. It was real, but that wasn't like how things were. Here's a photograph. It's hard to see. I know it's blurry, but this is basically barbed wire fence, which is keeping people inside these facilities. Here are people being put on the bus and being brought to the middle of the Utah desert. This is one thing that got me in trouble. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady of the United States, toured these camps and tried to put a positive light on them. And I can't remember what it was, but about a couple years ago, the Eleanor Roosevelt Center tweeted something how she was, humanitarian. I think I responded with this picture, and like I got people who were mad at me. I'm like, okay, whatever. But there are a lot of them. She actually had an article, I think it was in Life magazine or some popular publication, where she said how this is like really humane and this is a good thing. So even like people who are considered humanitarians, who are well respected Americans, the First Lady, who had I think a very good reputation, was supporting these things. We have some pictures of Korematsu. Here that's kind of cool with Rosa Parks. I think it's a cool picture. Eventually, Korematsu got a reparations check and a letter from the government apologizing. It wasn't for much. I think it was a few $1,000s, but it was some token saying we're sorry. President Clinton gave Korematsu the Medal of Freedom in 1998. And he passed away in the last decade, in 2005. See, I can't tell time, but 15 years ago. You'll find that when you get out of school, time becomes flat. Time passes and you don't recognize it. So now it's like, it's my first year of school, my second year, my sophomore, junior. Once you finish school, you don't have semesters anymore, right? You don't have fixed blocks of time to measure the passage of time. It's just life. So years come and go. You'll see, it's like, oh man, there's a fall semester, spring semester, summer, 1L, 2L, 3L. Once you graduate, it's like, oh my God, where did 20 years go? I was at the South Texas board meeting last night. We met all the alumni, and one of our members of our board, he graduated here 45 years ago. And he's still practicing. It's like insane that for 45 years, like, oh yeah, I graduated 45 years ago. Where did the time go? So you'll see what I mean. So if I forget if it's Tuesday or Thursday, you'll have to indulge me. As long as United reminds me when I have to get on a plane, then I'm good. Then I get the text message like, get in the plane now, Josh. I'm like, okay, get in the plane. It's you go to the airport, print out a boarding pass. Okay, that's where I'm going today. But that's the Korematsu pictures. We also have pictures of Matsuya Endo, who I think was working as a secretary. It's the best I can figure out what she was actually doing in this picture. I think she was employed as a secretary at the time. Okay. Any questions? Anything you want to mention about the video? I know there's a lot there, and I never know quite how to present it. I always have to sort of react to you. But anyone have any thoughts or comments you want to add before we get started? It's a lot to take in. If you want to watch it again later, I put the link in the notes, or not. No? All right. Who's next? So Ruben went. Which way was I going? Are you next, Jessica? Yes. Okay. I appreciate the honesty. Thank you, ma'am. Jessica, let's start with Hirabayashi. And I'll give you a brief overview first, but you got another 30-second reprieve. There were 3 Japanese detention cases. The only case people know is Korematsu. I don't quite know why, but for whatever reason, Korematsu has become like this famous case. People know Dred Scott, people know Plessy, and people know Korematsu. But Hirabayashi, the first case, is very important, and no one knows the guy's name. No one knows about him. This is Gordon Hirabayashi right there. So there were 3 cases, right? The first is Hirabayashi, and Hirabayashi considered the curfew. Right, it was a mandatory curfew for Japanese Americans. The second case is, of course, Korematsu. Korematsu only considered the exclusion order, right? The order saying you cannot be within certain zones on the West Coast. The third case is ex parte Endo. Ex parte Endo. Ex parte Endo was the actual case that the Japanese American prevailed in. And this case considered detention, right? Whether the government could detain you in these camps. Right? So the first two, Hirabayashi and Korematsu, the government won. And in the last one, Endo, the government lost. Now, no one knows about Endo, and no one knows about Hirabayashi. Everyone knows Korematsu. But Korematsu was probably, you know, as a matter of legal doctrine, it didn't break that much new ground. It more or less followed from Hirabayashi. Okay, so Jessica, you want to give me the facts, please, in Hirabayashi?
Yes. So Congress had enacted the statute that made it a misdemeanor to disregard the restrictions made by the commander of the military, and the commander of the military ordered that the people of Japanese ancestry remain in their house between 8 p.m. to 6 a.m.
Okay, very good.
And then Hirabayashi, who was of Japanese descent, disregarded the curfew knowingly.
Okay, good.
And then instead of registering for relocation, he turned himself into the FBI voluntarily and just told them he wouldn't relocate.
Okay, so everyone see the trap, right? The government put down a trap for people, and it was twofold. Number one, you had to stay in your house at night. Number two, you couldn't stay on the West Coast. Everyone see the trap, right? Again, number one, you had to remain in your home. You couldn't leave your home without permission. Number two, you were not allowed to remain in your home because of the exclusionary order. So you're screwed, right? No matter what you do, you're breaking the law. You're either going to break the law by violating the curfew, or you're going to break your law by staying in your house, in which case you're not following the exclusionary order. Everyone understand that sort of, you're trapped. And this was done quite deliberately. So first off, you say, oh, a curfew, that sounds reasonable, right? You know, well, why the hell do you need a curfew? I mean, what's going to happen at night? People are going to be lurking in the shadows in the dark, planning espionage. But this was a trap. The curfew was just a means to get people to be in violation of the law, because a curfew sounds reasonable. Okay. Now, Hirabayashi was unique. He was trying to challenge this regime. So he didn't go out and basically try and get arrested. He basically went to the government and said, hey, you know what? Take me. I'm not going to this camp. I'm not going to stay in my house. Do with me what you will. Right? He was trying to test this regime. Right? His case was the first one up at the court, decided in 1943. Not 1944, 1943. Korematsu was the next year. So this was the first case that came up. All right, so Katie, what did the court do in Hirabayashi?
What did they do? They just said that it wasn't really their place to say that or decide something that another court had already decided, and that he was guilty, and or that he did break the curfew, and that
What's the holding? What's the holding?
The holding? The holding is that they, I mean, there's three different ones. Do you want the concurrence? Do you want the actual holding?
What's a majority? Majority opinion.
Majority opinion is that it's affirmed, and that they said that whether they would have made the decision or not, it wasn't relevant. Like that when it was decided that they had every rational reason because of they were in a time of war and the time that it would take to weed out the loyal people and the not loyal people.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So we know Hirabayashi loses, right? He loses. But the reason why he loses is significant. So first off, right, Leslie, let me ask this question. Does the court require showing that Hirabayashi in particular was engaged in espionage or he was a spy or something like that? Okay. What then is the basis for having him subject to this curfew?
They had said that it didn't matter if they were, or like she said,
Oh, that's a perfect sentence. Give me that sentence again, the substantial one. Yeah.
Or power of the national government extends to every matter and activity so related to war as substantially to affect its conduct and progress.
Okay. Effectively, the court holds that the governments come forward and they said there's a risk of espionage. That these people, the entire race of Japanese Americans who live on the West Coast, may be involved in sabotage. Maybe in an ideal world, we would have the time to investigate each and every person, like all those kids drinking milk at the table, right? All those little kids, right? See if they're spies. But we don't have that time to investigate every person. So instead, we are going to use a broad policy in which we classify people on the basis of their ancestry, and we subject them to, in this case, the curfew. Right? Now, Colby, does the court see any role for itself in scrutinizing this claim that they need this broad classification? Does the court have any role for scrutinizing it? Why not?
Because they say that the executive branch, not the executive branch, but that they were basically doing it on a discretionary basis.
I'm sorry, what do you mean discretionary basis? Just give me a little bit more.
They were given a wide scope of exercise on discretion to determine the nature and extent of threat and injury or danger.
Was this a case, Colby, where the president was acting alone based on his own authority?
No.
What was he acting based on?
On an act by Congress.
And that's important. I want you to think about Youngstown. Youngstown hadn't happened yet, but this is sort of a preview of Youngstown and to Justice Jackson. We're not here dealing only with the president's executive power under the Constitution. We are dealing with a declaration of war, followed by Congress specifically giving the president the power to do what he needs to prosecute the war. Now, Jason, this becomes important with ex parte Endo. Does the statute Congress enacts say that the president can impose a curfew?
No.
Does the statute say that the president can build these camps, these internment camps?
No.
Ah. So then we go back to Justice Jackson, right? Is this an express authorization? Or what's the other word, Martin?
Implied.
See? Implied. And in the first two cases, they say, okay, this is good enough, it's implied. But the last one, Endo, we'll get to in a little bit, they say, oh, no, that goes too far, right? In other words, the law that Congress passed can support a curfew. Okay, that's reasonable. The law that Congress passed can support exclusion. Okay, that's reasonable. But the law that Congress passed cannot support detention camps. But wait a minute, Josh. If you tell people they have to stay in their homes, but then they have to leave, where are they going to go? Where are they going to go? Right? You tell someone you can't stay in your home, where the hell are they going to go? You got to keep them somewhere. So the entire premise of this is about delegation, right? Did Congress actually give the president the power to take these actions? Congress did not enact a statute saying, Mr. President, you can lock up citizens in this camp in the middle of the desert. They didn't say, Mr. President, you can round people up on buses and remove them from their homes. They didn't say, Mr. President, you can impose curfews to keep people in their houses at night. So this all goes down to what's implied delegations of authority. And if Hirabayashi is correct and Korematsu is correct, then Endo probably should come out the other way, but we'll get there in a bit. But here, at least, they say that the president and the Congress are on the same page. They all support the prosecution of the war. And the government can't pick out spies. They can't know for certain who might be disloyal. Right? And a curfew is reasonable. Now, Deanna, does a court merely say that, we can't be certain whether the threat exists, we'll just be deferring, or do they kind of go beyond that? Do they seem to, accept the facts? Do you think the justices agreed with the government that there was actually a threat from the Japanese Americans?
It seems
Oh, they do. Give me a little more, please.
I mean, they went into great detail.
Yes.
With
Pages.
like justifying.
Yeah.
the orders.
This wasn't a case. Okay, imagine the court said, look, we don't know whether the threat exists, so we're just going to defer. Right? Like, this is not for the court to second guess it. I get that holding, right? It's like, look, we don't know. We're not in the military. We don't have classified information. We're maybe suspicious, but we're not going to intervene. But Deanna says they got pages, right? They got page after page with all these allegations of Japanese Americans engaging in bad acts, right? And then they go on even further. They talk about assimilation, right? They say that these people do not assimilate into our culture, that the Japanese people are very different from Americans. They write that state laws have deprived Japanese people of being able to own property. They can't intermarry, right? Japanese parents send their kids to Japanese schools to support nationalist propaganda. They are dual citizens. There's a relatively little social intercourse between Japanese people and white people. Deanna, why on earth did the court spend pages, I think you're right, page after page after page, walking through this history?
I guess they probably knew that they were making a bad decision, and they had to justify it somehow.
Do you think that, I'm going to ask this very bluntly, do you think the majority, Deanna, thought this was a bad decision?
No, I think they thought it was a good decision,
Yeah.
and they agreed with the orders, but they maybe they knew that it would seem bad, especially in light of what was going on in Europe at the time.
Yep. Yeah. Again, maybe you can agree, disagree, but the majority opinion, I think, thinks this is a good idea. Not just that it's legal, but actually thinks this is a necessary policy for the government to have. That's how I read it. Maybe you can tell me I'm wrong. Matt?
I think you're wrong. I think, and I made this point in other classes, they figured, they already knew what they wanted the outcome to be, and they worked backwards. And they're going to find a justification for the.
Well, they could have done that, but they didn't need to put these details about assimilation, right? This was basically saying, look, this is not only legal, but it's good. It's right. It's a good policy. And maybe I don't know.
I can't believe that they thought that this was at all constitutional, but I think that they wanted to not do anything to get rid of the law. They liked the idea of putting these people in there, but regardless of what the Constitution said.
Yeah.
And so they came up with pages of reasons why these people are not worthy. I mean, it reads like Dred Scott. I mean,
well,
these people aren't worthy of.
Yeah.
These people can never be citizens.
That's what it gets
of
at.
their property.
That's what it gets at. Yeah. So maybe Matt's right. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know for sure, but I think Matt makes a fair point. But the majority is very. Let's go for it. Now let's do the concurrences. We got a couple of them. Again, the opinion was 9-0, unanimous, right? A unanimous decision from the U.S. Supreme Court. Again, everyone knows Korematsu. No one knows Hirabayashi, right? If we take Hirabayashi seriously and we say that the courts will defer in times of war and that they can't weed out who is and who is not loyal, then Korematsu follows naturally, right? When you have Hirabayashi as a precedent, Korematsu is easy. That's not a hard case to decide. So Caitlin, I want you to walk me through the concurrences. So the first concurrence we have in Hirabayashi is by Justice Douglas. It's a fairly brief concurrence, but just walk me through the Douglas opinion.
So he basically does agree that, with military decisions, they don't have the time to, kind of investigate and stuff like that. But he says that he wants to emphasize that the problem that they were dealing with was about loyalty, not assimilation.
Yeah, Douglas tries to say, look, this stuff in assimilation, I'm not with that. That's not my argument. But the government has to deal with these people on an emergency basis. And they can't impose some sort of stringent investigation on thousands and thousands of people. Right? But we go no further. Now, Katie, we got Justice Murphy, right? We know Justice Murphy wrote a very vigorous dissent in the second case in Korematsu. But what does Justice Murphy say here? He's really like. By the way, Justice Murphy was the Catholic seat, right? It sounds silly, right? But in the early 20th century, there's always one Catholic justice. There was always one Jewish justice and one Catholic justice. That a seat. He was a Catholic justice, so he had perhaps a little bit more experience with this sort of bigotry that maybe the justices hadn't. So, Katie, what's Murphy getting at?
So he said that in concurring, he didn't mean to say that in times of war, the military can just do whatever they want, and that the Constitution must be obeyed no matter whether it's wartime or
Yeah. And this raises a concept. There's an expression. It's Latin. I won't give you the Latin, but I'll give it to you in English. It's from Cicero. It says, "In times of war, the laws fall silent." This is not something that Justice Scalia made up or anyone else. This is an old expression. It comes from the Roman times. And it's very often the case that when there's a conflict, military conflict, people simply say, let's relax, let's excuse the usual rules because we have a greater enemy, we have a greater purpose, we have a greater mission that we have to handle, which is the prosecution of the war. And I think the Hirabayashi majority largely embraces this concept that when you have this world war, this global conflict going on, that we don't enforce the laws quite so rigorously. And here we have Murphy writing in 43 says, "When the danger is past, this restriction should be removed promptly and their freedom restored." But the rub is often when you have laws that are suspended during times of war, they don't come back. One of the reasons why Youngstown was such a significant case was we were in the middle of a war, and you had 6 justices tell the president, "You cannot take these steel mills." And the president said, "Okay," and he complied. That doesn't happen in history. That's a rarity, if you will. But here in Hirabayashi, the court said, "Well, this is just a curfew. We are not dealing with the exclusion order yet. We're not dealing with the order on the detention camps," but they all knew what was coming, right? Again, when Hirabayashi was written, they all knew the other elements of the case were in the pipeline, right? You cannot write Hirabayashi in like a cone of silence. It's coming down the pike next with Korematsu in the next year. Okay? Okay. All right. So any questions on Hirabayashi? Very important case that no one even knows the name of it, but very significant case. Yes, sir, Ruben.
Would you say that General DeWitt was kind of like the expert that the court's taking?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yeah. So let me go back to the. I put that picture up a few minutes ago of the poster. Does that have DeWitt's name on it? It is. Yeah. If you look, it's hard to read, but see at the very bottom. Let me make it a little bit bigger. There it is. You can see a little. See J.L. DeWitt. Everyone can kind of see that. It's a little blurry. He was the commanding army of the Western Front, and basically, President Roosevelt issued this executive order. And the executive order said, we need to do everything we can to prosecute this war. I give General DeWitt the power to do so. Now, Ruben, I'll ask you the question. Did Roosevelt's orders say round up the Japanese people?
No.
Okay. Did Roosevelt's orders say build these camps?
No.
Who actually issued those directives?
I guess it would be the. Okay. The general.
That's how delegation works, right? The president doesn't get his hands dirty, right? The president doesn't actually sign the order rounding up Japanese people. He says, I give the general the power to do what has to be done. Wink, wink, nod, nod, go for it, man. Right? Now, do you think for a minute, Ruben, the general could do this without the president's consent? No, he'd be fired immediately, right? So this is how, any organization, you have change of authority, right? The person at the top gives an instruction to the guy below him, and it's like, okay, now I'm going to do the hard work. But the guy at the top is like, oh, it wasn't me. Yes? So this is actually a very good question about delegation, right? We'll get to this with Endo. But can Congress give the executive branch basically a blank check to handle the war-making efforts without any guidance. Right now, on the other side, war is very volatile. It changes on a short notice. So, can you imagine the president has to go to the Congress every time they want to bomb a new city or every time they want to launch a new mission? That might be a little bit dangerous. But here we're in the home front, and this is a policy where they had to, build camps and purchase business. A lot of things had to happen. So I actually think these are delegation cases. I think all these could have been struck down by saying it was a violation of non-delegation doctrine, but that's Josh talking. Everything for me is about delegation. I sound one note very, very often, but it's a very good question, Kimberly. Thank you for that. All right. Any other questions, Hirabayashi? Okay. So we go on to the next case, Korematsu. And Korematsu, again, was about the exclusionary order. And the way it worked, here, let me pull this map back up. I showed you the map a few minutes ago. See this thick black line over here? Okay. The thick black line? That was called the exclusion area. If you lived anywhere in that area, which is basically the entire West Coast, and it goes into like New Mexico, right? Almost to New Mexico. You are now subject to this regime. And if you lived in one of these places, you had to report to one of these cities, and they would relocate you to these triangles, which are these camps, which are put throughout the country, right? They were called, what they called them? The relocation center. Well, there were three kinds. There were so you see the map, right? There were the circles, the triangles, and the squares, right? The circles were where they'd have to be rounded up. So these are the big cities in California. Then they'd be relocated to the triangles, Tule Lake, Manzanar, etc. And eventually they'd be put in these isolation centers, which were out further west. So the idea was you basically move these people further and further west. All right. Korematsu was prosecuted for not complying with exclusionary order. Okay? Jamie, can you walk me through the court's analysis, please, from Justice Black for the majority in Korematsu?
Supreme Court about how it would be suspicious if everything was based on racial classifications.
Okay, good. Let's do that for a minute, right? So, Jamie, what's the most obvious constitutional defect? Like a 5-year-old can understand this, right? The most obvious constitutional defect with this exclusionary order.
Is it about due process?
Well, specifically, why is what the government's doing so obviously defective? Right? What about it?
Because they're taking the fact that, or they're saying that the Japanese people are a threat, but they're not looking into if each person actually is a threat.
Okay, very good. We have a racial classification, right? We have a racial classification. The government is punishing people, U.S. citizens, based solely on their nationality. Okay? And we have a constitutional provision that might suggest this is not good. Now, someone says, oh, Josh, equal protection, right? Isn't that the answer? Well, not so clear, right? And the reason why is that the Equal Protection Clause is in the 14th Amendment. Suit jacket, I have an emergency. I always have a backup. These come in handy. I always carry extra. They come very much handy. Okay. We have the 14th Amendment, right, which says that no state shall deny a person equal protection to law. But the problem is that the 14th Amendment only limits federal power. I'm sorry, only limits state power. Right? The 14th Amendment limits the state power. The 14th Amendment does not limit the federal power. Sometime later, the Supreme Court would hold, oh, yes, it does, right, that the federal government can't violate equal protection. But here in the 40s, they have not held that yet. So as a result, we have the Due Process Clause, which says that the government cannot deprive a person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay. Nancy, are the people who are rounded up and excluded given any process before they're denied their liberty? the people who are subject to this exclusion order, are they given any process before they're being denied their liberty? Okay. What is the basis on which they're being rounded up? Their nationality, right? They're being rounded up solely based on their nationality. Now, Ben, let me ask you a question. What might be another procedure the government could come up with to actually give some sort of process before you apply this exclusionary order to people? What might be a process you could come up with?
Some sort of hearing.
Yeah. Yeah, have a hearing, right? Investigate them. Administer a loyalty oath, right? Renounce their citizenship to Japan. Search their homes, see if they have any radios or bomb-making equipment. I don't know, whatever, right? I'm sure you could come up with some crap, right? Ben, but did the government impose any of these sorts of processes to determine if a threat was credible?
I don't think they did.
Okay. Now, if you were the government, you were General DeWitt, what's your argument? Why aren't you doing these sorts of things?
They didn't have the time or resources to do it.
Yeah, and this is the time of war argument where laws sort of just come apart. They say, look, if we had all the time in the world, we would make this elaborate procedure, but we don't. We have this threat, and we need to remove these people in the next 24 hours. Got to get rid of them now. And this was the best we can do. And we said we're using racial classifications. Now, the court says a few things that are important, right? The court says, and this is an important sentence, I want you to just flag this in your notes. The court says that all legal restrictions which curtail the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect. All legal restrictions which curtail the civil rights of a single racial group are immediately suspect. Nick, tell me, what does that sentence mean I just read to you?
That it probably violates the Constitution.
Well, what's it?
That these actions, these decisions.
Well, specifically, what's this?
Oh, probably.
What probably violates the Constitution?
Public Proclamation Act.
But you're answering my question indirectly. What about the public proclamation probably violates the Constitution? The racial classification thing, yeah. You were answering like everything around my question. Yeah, you're going down the field, right? So Nick, the court says that racial classifications are immediately suspect. What does that phrase mean, immediately suspect? Immediately suspect. What does that phrase mean?
That it should be called into question.
Yeah. Think of Justice Jackson, the third tier, right? Where you're skeptical. Where you're suspicious, right? Suspect, think of like the word suspicious, right? You're suspicious. When the government says we are making decisions based solely on a person's bloodline, based on their ancestry, we're suspicious. This framework will become known as strict scrutiny. You got to keep that phrase in your mind, strict scrutiny. The court would later hold that racial classifications are suspect classifications. They're suspect, they're suspicious, and they're reviewed with strict scrutiny. In other words, think of Justice Jackson's lowest rung, right? Where you kind of take a magnifying glass, you look at it very carefully and say, "Oh man, this is fishy. Something weird's going on here." Yes, Nick, go ahead.
Real quick, you just kind of got to me before I found it. Do you know where in the book that sentence is? I just want to highlight it.
I don't remember. It's in it.
On 584.
Thank you, Matt. Yeah, I don't have the page handy.
Second paragraph.
Cool.
584, second paragraph.
I'm gonna locate it by the time you call it on.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, Matt, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Yeah, I don't have the page number handy, but that sounds about right. Immediately suspect. Now, Jonathan, let me ask you a follow-up, please. Does that mean that this law is unconstitutional?
I guess not.
Yeah, you guess not. The court says that even though it's suspect, you subject it to the most rigid scrutiny. But the court says pressing public necessity may sometimes justify the existence of such restrictions. Racial antagonism never can. Jonathan, what are they saying, right? Necessity can justify it, but racial antagonism cannot. What are they getting at there?
So like when there's like a greater need for it,
Yeah.
like so in times of war, whenever like they have to do it to like save like I guess the nation.
But what's racial antagonism? What's that phrase mean?
I guess just racism.
Bigotry, yeah. Whatever word you want to use. So the court's basically saying you can use a racial classification for some sort of greater purpose, but you can't use it because of racism itself. Now, how do you disentangle the two, right? Was this policy based on a credible threat, or was it based just on a disfavor of Japanese Americans, right? The dissent, at least Justice Murphy makes it say this is racism right here. That's what we got. But the majority says no, this is there, which is why I want to go back to Matt's question a few minutes ago. I think there are discussion of the assimilation stuff. Which way does that cut? Does that suggest as public necessity, or that's just based on their own views of race? And
You asking me what my opinion is on that?
go for it. You have the floor. I mean,
Racism is a pretty common thing.
Yeah.
It still is. You know, all men are created equal was a pretty narrowly defined group in most, in the minds of most of the people who wrote the document. And times changed, you know, slowly, eventually. But they, I think human nature, mainly in nature, to be suspicious of outsiders.
yeah.
Particularly, America is a uniquely heterogeneous society, so and it becomes more so all the time. I think that's growing pains.
So the idea that racial antagonism doesn't work, but national security does, requires deciding, is this evidence actually accurate then, right? In other words, if the court simply says we're going to defer blankly, then you don't need to get into these sorts of debates. But they say we need to decide, is this based on national pressing necessity, or is it based on racism, right? Which seems to suggest the court can decide which is which. Here, though, we have a problem. The government gave lots of evidence that there was this threat, that there was this actual threat among Japanese Americans. It was made up. I don't want to put this point too bluntly, but the government put information to the court that simply was not accurate. There were reports suggesting that this threat was not real, and those reports were suppressed. They were held back. So even the U.S. government knew that this was bullshit, right? That this wasn't like accurate, but they withheld that information from the court. About a decade ago, 2010 or 11 or so, the U.S. Solicitor General at the time sent a letter to the court apologizing, saying that we screwed up, that we did not give you correct information about this case. We're sorry. 7 years later, but they did it, so I guess better late than never, I guess, right? But here the court says we have information that this is a military necessity, and we're not going to second guess it. Then the court explains that whatever the law was in Hirabayashi supports this, right? That if Hirabayashi can support the curfew, if Hirabayashi can support the curfew, then in this case, Korematsu can support the exclusionary order, right? You keep someone in their home, you keep someone out of their home. They're of the same level, the court says. Now again, the court does not talk about detention here. They go out of the way not to. That's the next case, ex parte endo. But at bottom, the court upholds it. They say that this is not punishment based on Japanese antagonism, right? This is deemed necessary because it's not practical to determine who is loyal and who is not. Now, Dylan, let me ask you a question. Let's just assume that maybe you need to exclude these people quickly, but then these people were in a camp for a full year, 2 years, whatever it was. What could the government have done after they were initially rounded up to perhaps reduce the population there.
They could have gone through certain individuals that
Okay.
wouldn't have been a threat.
Right. Even if they initially needed to round people up, which I don't think is the case, they could have, after the fact, done some sort of hearing or procedure to vet if individuals were threatened, and then release them, let them go home. Right, let them go home. But that was not done here. The court, though, says this is only a temporary exclusion, and they have this phrase, temporary exclusion. It's in the book, right? Because they recognize this sort of indefinite holding couldn't suffice. So they said, look, all we're saying is that on, what was the date? May 24th, 1942, right? May 24th, 1942, basically 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was December 41. On May 23rd, 1942, they had to do this emergency thing. We will not consider anything happen afterwards. Do you recognize how narrow the holding is, right? Korematsu was only about this poster, basically, right? Could they issue this poster? And they didn't consider at all the fact that almost 2.5 years had elapsed since this poster was put up and the case got to the court. It was decided, I think, in December 44. So almost 2.5 years went by. So you see how narrow they wrote this opinion to only consider part of the matter. Any questions so far? The court also talks about hardship. They say, to be sure, there's a hardship imposed on these people, but during war, everyone has hardships. There's rationing, right? Other things. Well, I mean, come on. They're working really hard over time here. But they say when our shores are threatened by hostile forces, the power to protect must be commensurate, must be proportional with the threatened danger. And the court concludes at the very end, they say, we cannot say that these actions were unjustified. We will not rely on hindsight. What do they mean, hindsight? Mitchell, what do they mean we can't rely on hindsight? What are they getting at there?
They don't want...
What does hindsight mean in general?
Hindsight's learning from your mistakes.
Okay, so we're now 2.5 years from Pearl Harbor. What would hindsight maybe teach us in this case?
This was probably a bad idea.
Well, not just a bad idea, was it necessary?
No.
Okay. The court here is saying we're not going to make a ruling based on hindsight. We will limit ourselves as if this is all we have, that this May 23rd, 1942 order is all we got. And that way the court narrowed its decision significantly. Okay. Question on the majority opinion by Justice Black. So as I mentioned, by the way, Black, if you recall, wrote the majority in Youngstown also. There's some evidence to think that he kind of regretted this opinion later, and that's why in Youngstown they sort of went out of their way to like rebuke the president. Not for sure, but there's some evidence. Yeah, Mitchell, go ahead.
So this is in the 1940s, and like amidst World War and everything. Could it also be determined like there's outside influence of the rest of the world doing these types of camps on other?
Yeah, and they're probably worse in some regards.
My grandmother was in one in Indonesia, the whole place.
Really? It was.
So, yeah, I'm just considering like maybe they thought, oh, everybody else is doing it.
Okay, yeah, I see your point, Mitchell. You remember at the end of the video that I showed you, they said we're trying to set a standard for the world with Christian decency. Remember they had that line at the end? They were basically signaling like, look, you think this is bad? Go look what the camps like in Germany or in Poland, right? I don't know about the Indonesian camps, but they probably were not very. No, you wouldn't know. The history here is very severe. There were some pretty awful places, and what they were saying is, look, as bad as this is, other places I think are worse. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I read or maybe heard or something that President Roosevelt had put in a couple Supreme Court justices. Is that like
Roosevelt? By the time Franklin Roosevelt died, he had made 9 appointments to the Supreme Court.
And so I'm just curious, like historical context, how quickly were these people implemented, or how recently before some of these cases?
Okay, well that's a good question. So Roosevelt made his appointments with one goal in mind. would they uphold his New Deal legislation? So think of the National Labor Relations Act. Think of Darby, right? Think of Wicker v. Filburn with the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Roosevelt made his picks in the mid to late 1930s with the idea to, okay, who's going to uphold a broad federal power? What he didn't anticipate was that several of them, Justice Jackson, Justice Murphy, Justice Douglas, would go against him on war powers, and that was not anticipated. So look, the vote in Korematsu was 6-3, right? So basically, you had 3 Roosevelt appointees: Roberts. Actually, Owen Roberts was not a Roosevelt appointee. I take that back. He was on the court before. But you have Murphy and Jackson, who voted against Roosevelt. And then some years later, you had Youngstown, where all the Roosevelt appointees voted against Truman, the steel seizure. So let me put it this way. When a justice is appointed, the president has a very specific goal in mind. They don't think about other things. So why did George W. Bush pick John Roberts? The short answer is the war on terror. That was like the defining issue of the 2000s, right? Guantanamo Bay. And Chief Justice Roberts had been an appellate judge, and he wrote a very favorable opinion to the administration. And that was apparently very important in deciding whether Bush would pick this person or that person. Now, then John Roberts does Obamacare. Oh, we didn't see that coming, right? So when presidents pick justice for one specific purpose, they don't always anticipate the other spillover effects, right? Why was Brett Kavanaugh picked? He's great on the administrative law. What about other things? Well, we don't know, right? So I think you can never get someone who touches all of your bases. I think that sort of answers your question. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, you should raise your hand before, but I'll give you a post rebuke.
Yes. I just want to acknowledge that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a question about Milton Eisenhower. Is he related?
Yeah, I think it was Dwight Eisenhower, maybe a son or his nephew. I know they're related. I can't recall the relation, but you can probably Google that and figure it out. But I think they were related. Yeah. Again, this was basically someone Googled Milton Eisenhower. I think it was either the son or the nephew or something, but basically a close relative of the commanding general of the forces in Europe. So this wasn't like some random actor they hired. Imagine we like Ronald Reagan.
Right. Well, it reminds me of
Reagan did some of these films also. Yeah.
This reminds me of Eisenhower saying his 2 biggest mistakes were on the Supreme Court.
Yeah, Eisenhower said his biggest damn mistake was Earl Warren.
Yeah.
He was right. Yeah, Braid.
Here's a younger brother.
Oh, it was a brother. Okay, thank you. I knew it was a close relative. So well, we will. Okay, but I think that's right. I knew it was a close relative. I can't remember exactly who. All right. Anyone else? Any other questions on the majority in not Youngstown, Korematsu? Where am I? Who's next? Amy. Amy, you want to walk me through the Frankfurter concurrence? Again, Frankfurter was a law professor. He was a Roosevelt appointee. He was very gung-ho on federal power, but he's a little bit like nervous here, a little cautious. He's like, I agree, but.
Well, he agreed because he thought that if it was okay in the Hirabayashi case for the confusion, why would it not be okay in this case when they both were going around the race? But he also said it would be looking, I don't know how to word it. He was saying that the Constitution gave the military or Congress this power to do these things through the military, and they shouldn't be second guessing how Congress and the president want to do it.
Yeah. Frankfurter has this one line that I like to read. He says, "This is their business, not ours." Right? This is the business for the elected branches, not us. We're just judges. And if you think about it, look, judges sit in their chambers. They're not on the battlefield. They don't get classified briefings of information, right? Maybe they check Twitter. I don't know, but they don't. All of our classified stuff's on Twitter anyway. It doesn't even matter, right? But they don't see the real stuff. All they can see is what the parties bring to them. And Frankfurter's like, look, if Congress thinks there's a problem, Congress can deal with it. But so far, Congress has deferred to every action that's been taken, right? You can imagine Roosevelt says, okay, let's build some camps. And Congress, what the hell are you doing? No, that's insane. We're not going to do that. But they didn't say that. They were like, go for it. And so this is more or less, if you think of the first zone of Youngstown, Frankfurter's saying if both Congress is okay with it and the president's okay with it, the court should give it a light touch. Think of like kid gloves, right? We're not going to go too hard on it. Thank you, Amy. Any other questions on Frankfurter? All right, Kyle, let's go through the second one. That was the first dissent, I should say. Justice Owen Roberts. What does Owen Roberts find that this problem is so problematic?
He sees that, like, in order to do this, and by the way that he was found guilty, is that he never even really stood a chance against it. He was basically losing on both ends, and all of this was based on racism.
Okay, yeah, there are a couple points, right? I think you said correctly, right? Justice Roberts, but this is not John Roberts, it's Owen Roberts. Justice Owen Roberts says there's a trap, right, where there are conflicting orders. Where one order says you got to stay in your house, and the other order says if you stay in your house, you're in violation of the law. So basically, you're forcing people to break the law, and the only way to avoid breaking the law was to go to one of these reporting centers, these relocation centers. So it's basically like trapping people to go to these camps. Like you couldn't get out of the trap. And that way, you were stuck. And therefore, there was no way to challenge this regime unless you got yourself arrested. And once you get yourself arrested, you're in jail, right? So you have a choice. You either go to jail or go to one of these camps. And in one case, you're a felon, right? You're breaking federal law. So Justice Justice Roberts, like, this is a trap. Braden, let's go through the Murphy dissent. I think this is like the one that gets the most resonance, I think, among the various opinions. What's Justice Murphy's argument here?
I think he just was saying just flat out racist.
Yeah.
He said such exclusion goes over the very brink of constitutional power, falls into the ugly abyss of racism.
Yeah, straight up, right? There's no, there's not much any doubting in his mind. And this line, it says you're over the very brink of constitutional power and falls into the ugly abyss of racism. He wrote a concurrence in Hirabayashi, which we talked about a few minutes ago, where he said in Hirabayashi, this goes to the very brink of constitutional power. And the next one is this goes over the brink. Brink is like a border. Now, Kimberly, this might sound like a dumb question, but what provision of the Constitution prohibits racism? I know that it sounds like a dumb question, but it's actually important for Justice Murphy here.
I mean, I think the closest thing you get is the due process clause, equal protection.
Well, does the Equal Protection Clause limit federal power?
No.
Okay, this is a problem for Justice Murphy, right? He says this is obvious racial discrimination. Okay, I agree. And it deprives people of the equal protection of the law. But at this time, the court said the Equal Protection Clause does not limit federal power, only limits state power. So he's basically relying on a provision of the Constitution that doesn't apply to the federal government. Maybe the answer is due process, right? Maybe that you have to give someone various procedures before you lock them up. But under the current regime here, the federal government can be as racist as it wants to be. So that's one of the wrinkles in the Murphy opinion, right? He doesn't quite explain this. But he says that this law is unconstitutional. It's not reasonable to assume that all Japanese people are dangerous. And it's based on questionable racial and sociological grounds. He says that the majority cites misinformation, half-truths, insinuations, fake news, right? This is not real. So even at least one of the judges is willing to say that this is bullshit. This is not actual evidence that justifies a detention policy. Okay? He also writes that they're moving at a leisurely pace, that now these people have been there for years and they're not holding trials, right? They're not holding proceedings to actually determine if this threat is legitimate. He says it's much easier to hold hearings than to have to deport 100,000 people. All right. At the end, he writes, I dissent, therefore, from this legalization of racism. Racial discrimination has no part whatever in our way of life. They must be treated at all times as Americans and entitled to their rights and freedoms. Okay. Frank Murphy wasn't on the court very long, but this is probably his most famous opinion, if I had to summarize. Okay, anything else on Justice Murphy? I heard a sigh. Any hands on Justice Murphy? All right. Let's go on to the next one, Justice Robert Jackson. Again, Justice Jackson, we know, would go on to serve as the lead prosecutor in Nuremberg during the war crime trials for the Nazis. We also know that Justice Jackson wrote the leading opinion in Youngstown. But here, I think Jackson was fairly junior. He was one of the newer justices at this point. And he goes out and lays his theory out. So, folks, let me call on you, sir. What is Justice Jackson's argument about why this is lawful? I'm sorry, unlawful.
He begins with Korematsu that he was a citizen and that the act was commonly a crime.
Yeah.
He also indicated that the criminal element was based on the ancestry.
Good.
And I know you said something about the civil courts.
Yeah.
The civil courts had no authority to enforce an act that was unconstitutional, that they ceased to abide by the function that the civil court would abide to.
Yeah, I think, okay, you said a lot of good things. Let me do them one at a time. Thank you, sir. So first off, Jackson explains that this is a law that basically makes someone guilty of a crime based on their blood, right? Based solely on their racial stock. And Jackson explains that you cannot have, in the American system, punishment for crimes based solely on your race. Right? That goes against a long history. In England, there were certain crimes of treason, right? And the punishment actually went beyond death, right? Let's say you were accused of being a traitor and you were executed. What happens to your property? The state could actually prevent your heirs from inheriting your property. You basically kill the bloodline, because back in England, all you had was land. That's all you had, right? That was your black acre. That was your land, right? And we don't have that in our Constitution. You cannot have what's called corruption of the blood, where you basically punish the bloodline going down. And Jackson says that this entire notion of punishing people based solely on their ancestry, U.S. citizens, is inconsistent with that history. Okay. Jackson also says that there was no evidence taken to support this regime. Rather, they just took what General DeWitt said and they didn't test it. There's no evidence in the military order. And Jackson says, I can't accept an order like this without any evidence. Okay? Jackson also has a very good line where he says, look, this military order is short term, right? Whatever the government does eventually will end. But the court here blesses it. And the court writes an opinion upholding it. And Jackson describes the opinion to a loaded gun that sort of sits around waiting to be fired at some point, right? Because you can use this precedent at some point in the future. Indeed, during the Bush administration with the Guantanamo cases, there was a debate. Should they cite Korematsu? It was good law, had never been overruled. But the Bush administration said, we're not going to rely on Korematsu. It's just too toxic, right? But this opinion sort of lied around. We'll get to the Trump v. Hawaii case in a minute, but this case was around for many years. Okay? All right. Any evidence, any further thoughts on the Robert Jackson opinion, the dissent? All right, so now there's some background information which is in the book. By the time Korematsu was decided, the administration had already announced they were shutting down the camps. This wasn't a coincidence. The Chief Justice Stone, was in contact with the administration, and they apparently gave some sort of heads up saying, hey, we're going to be maybe shutting down the camps. So by the time this opinion came out, the controversy was basically what we call moot, right? It didn't matter. So they went out of their way to uphold this broad power in a case that was irrelevant, because the government already said we're going to shut down the camps. So this entire thing was, I don't want to say for nothing, that's not accurate, but like the entire case didn't need to exist, right? You didn't need this decision precisely because the case was already mooted. Okay. Yes, sir, Nick.
I thought the Supreme Court couldn't rule on cases that were moot.
Well, they're not supposed to. They're not supposed to. I mean, it was still technically a live controversy because the conviction was there. Whether or not, let me put it this way, whether or not the camps were shut down, Korematsu was still in violation of the exclusionary order at the time. So you still have to hear the case, but the actual dispute about the camps was, I think moot. I don't know.
It's also significant that the order wasn't published until 3 weeks after the date of the order, which was the day before.
Yeah, I mean that gets a bit into the weeds, but you basically had this. There were no PDFs back then, right? There was no online website, so to actually get government documents out took time. And I don't know if there was a delay that was deliberate, but it's also Christmas time in December, so the order was dated and it wasn't actually made public till a couple weeks later. Now that could have been based on printing schedules. It could have been based on, it was Christmas, New Year, people were taking time off. I can't tell you the reason why, but at least people in Washington knew this was coming, even if it hadn't been, spread nationwide.
This wouldn't have been widely known.
Yeah, today we have government by tweet, where there's a tweet. Okay, that's the law, right? Back then it didn't work like that. Lord help us. Yeah, I was at the New York Times office last week in D.C. and I was like, we need to put like a big, like a ticker on the wall whenever there's a presidential tweet, just start beep 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 beep, to alert everyone. Yeah, make my life easier. Okay. All right. So questions on Korematsu. I'll do Endo in a minute. All right. So Michael, let's move on to the next case, right? Which is ex parte Endo, and this is a weird case, and I don't mean weird in that the outcome is weird. I think the outcome more or less is right, but it's weird in just like, how did you just write these other two opinions in Hirabayashi and Korematsu and say, oh, but you can't do this, right? How does the court decide that the camps are not legal? Just walk me through the court's reasoning here, please.
They said that the camps, they didn't really have any relation to just putting those people in the internment camps.
Relation to what? What do you mean? Give me a little bit more. You're on the right track. Okay. Well, Mike, let me ask you this question, right? What authority was the government relying on to open up these camps?
Congress.
Okay. And what did the statute that Congress enacted actually say? Did it say you can open camps? No. People are noisy out there, man. Okay. What did the statute actually say?
To stop from sabotage.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. So the law that Congress actually enacted said, okay, we need to get rid of sabotage, right? Michael, did it say anything about building, a dozen camps in the desert and putting people to live there and work there? Okay. So Angela, let me ask you this question, please. Why does the court think then that the president can't implement this sort of these camps, these places? What's like the thinking there? I'm sorry? It takes away their liberty, but how come you can take away their liberty in the first two cases, but not this case? Why are they different?
This one is because I think that they had given authority over to the civilian people, and it wasn't a part of the military anymore. So.
Good. Right. What? Or one more question, Angela. You're almost done. I'm sorry. Do you think if Congress wanted to authorize detention camps, do you think they would have said so expressly or just sort of left it for implication?
It would have been against the Constitution, so they probably would have just
But if Congress had wanted to give the president the power to create these camps, do you think they would have just sort of left it quiet, or they would have said expressly? Okay, this goes back to Martin's question a few minutes ago, right? If Congress wanted to give the president the power to create these massive concentration camps, or debate, whatever you want to call internment camps, whatever you want to call them, right? If Congress wanted to give if Congress wanted to give this power, they would have said so, not implied, but express. And Angela, did they make an express delegation here? No, they did not. So the court basically says is, well, we know Congress wants to stop espionage, but we don't think they want to do this. Therefore, the president can't do it. Whoa. Destiny, let me ask you a follow-up question. Had Congress then the very next day enacted a statute saying, President Roosevelt, we give you the power to build camps to lock up all the Japanese people, would the court have upheld that? Yeah, they would have. Why? Why is the answer yes? Oh, man. I can never play poker. I'd be the worst bluffer ever. I'm so bad. But Destiny, but why do you think the court would have upheld if Congress expressly said you can build these camps? Was there any constitutional difficulties with that issue? Okay, she's right. Even though I am such a bad bluffer. My God, it's terrible. By the way, like I will never play a card game because I'll just give away everything. I'll give away the house. By the way, when you have your review session, I will not have written the exam yet. Because one year I actually wrote the exam and did the review session afterwards, and I had one guy, one sat right there. He was like, "So, is this on the exam? Is that on the exam?" He started asking all these questions. I'm like, "No." So my exam, I'm going to write it after I talk to you. You're not going to get anything out of me, but yeah, nodding, fine. Okay, thank you. I think she's right. I think Destiny is exactly correct, right? The court here does not say it's unconstitutional. If Congress wants to lock up in camps people based on their race, they can do it. There's no constitutional problem. We have a war. But they didn't do that here. They enacted a general statute, implied authorization, where they said, well, we want you to go ahead and get rid of spies. So the court says it goes enough to cover curfews, that goes enough to cover exclusion, but not camps. It doesn't go that far. Now, I got a problem with this holding, right, Caroline? Caroline, so the law says you can keep people out of their houses and you exclude them from California and the entire West Coast. Where the hell are they going to go? Where are you going to put them? Do you think Congress, Caroline, was okay with the construction of these camps? You don't think so?
Well, no.
Why not?
Well, because like you said, they didn't expressly.
No, but my point is, after Roosevelt started building these camps, do you think Congress had any objection to it? Well, think of the video we saw, right? Do you think the American people generally were like saying, oh, we can't do this? Okay. The majority's opinion is a little bit hard to swallow, I think, right? Everyone knew what was going on, but the court says, we don't think Congress would have wanted it. Well, we don't really need to speculate, do we? We know what they thought, and they were okay with it. They produced videos saying how awesome this was, right? Money was being appropriated to fund these camps, right? These camps don't just pop up overnight. There's got to be money spent. Congress has to be aware of this. Went on for, God, almost 2 years. So the majority wrote this narrow opinion saying that if Congress wants to do this, they would have done so expressly. Right? There's an expression we use in the law. It's from Justice Scalia, one of my favorite ones. It says, Congress doesn't put elephants in mouse holes, right? What the hell does that mean? That if Congress wants to do something very big, they'll say so. They won't kind of just hide it and say it secretly. But here, Congress, I think, was quite okay with this. So this is, to Kimberly's question, this is a delegation case, right? Congress gave a broad delegation, and the court says, well, we don't think they delegated this power, but they delegated this power. In other words, Congress said yes to curfews, yes to exclusion, no to camps. They did not delegate that much power. We don't think they would have, because such a holding would trample on civil liberties, and we don't think they would go that far without telling us expressly. Now, to designate, if Congress did enact that statute, well, that's cool, right? They can, the Concentration Camp Act of 1944, go for it, right? But that's not the law they got enacted. They enacted a more generalized, implied law. Okay, everyone get that? Everyone get the holding of Endo? So the court says the camps are illegal. Congress could fix it, perhaps they want. but they're not unconstitutional. This can be remedied by Congress. All right, everyone get the majority. All right, so you have concurrences, right? You have Murphy. Murphy's saying, yeah, this is still racism, right? Don't be stupid. This is racism. And then you have Justice Roberts again, right? Who again talks about the due process clause. Okay. Any questions on ex parte endo? Yes, Deanna?
Could you clarify a little more on why the majority in the first two cases went against, like, said that the due process clause wasn't applicable here?
Well, the majority says the due process clause is applicable, but that the process given was all the process that was due under the circumstances. So think of the phrase due process, right? What does that mean? What process is due under the circumstances? Maybe in times of peace you get more process, but in times of war you get less process. And the process given here, which was basically nothing, was all that was required, was all that was due. But it's very hard to square cases 1 and 2 with 3, with Hirabayashi and Korematsu with Endo. It requires a bit of gymnastics. Right? You got to do some twisting and turning to get there. And I can't do gymnastics. Yeah, Nick.
So they keep referring to people who were loyal. So was it already determined at this point that Endo was loyal?
There were no hearings held about loyalty, but there was also no evidence to suggest she was disloyal in her trial.
Okay, so why do they keep referring to loyalty?
The basis of the entire regime is that the government can't decide who is loyal and who is not. So to prevent spies from potentially living in our communities, we have to just get them all out of there. Right? We can't tell who is and who is not good.
I get that, but they're saying that she is concededly loyal.
Oh, so in her case in particular, the government did not introduce any evidence saying that she was disloyal. Right?
So
And
they flipped the standard from the last 2 cases from
well again,
loyal to
yeah.
they're disloyal.
In the first 2 cases, you're dealing with a wide range of people, right? On the last one, there's no evidence that there was grounds to hold her because she was disloyal. Yeah, Braden.
I'm trying to kind of, what should I really get out of these cases? That's what I'm trying to, like, in a sense of maybe exams, because it seems to me all it is executive order, Congress enacts legislation, national emergency, go ahead, do what you want. That's essentially what they're saying. So, I mean, like, what's the real takeaway here? Just you can do whatever you want at this period of time?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. Well, let me ask you, Braden, is this still good law?
No, but it's kind of.
But why is the answer no?
Why?
Yeah, why is this not good law anymore?
Well, it's probably because I would say, look at I don't know, it goes back to Youngstown, I guess, a little bit, because then you establish the tiers.
Yeah, but we're in zone 1, my friend.
It is zone 1, but you said the 14th Amendment comes.
Looks, you generally can't have racial classifications, but if there's a really good reason, you can have it. That's still the law. So a couple years ago, I'll try and answer your question a little bit differently. A couple years ago, Justice Breyer was asked if, this could ever happen again. And Breyer said, no, it would never happen again. And then Scalia said, of course it could happen again. We had a case at the Supreme Court about a year ago called Trump against Hawaii. I didn't assign it. If you want it, I'll give you a copy to read. It's not a very good teaching case because there's not a lot of ConLaw in it, but it involved the travel ban, which was the administration's policy to deny entry to aliens from 6 predominantly Muslim nations. And there were lots of reasons why he had it. I don't need to go into the details, but Korematsu played a role in the case. Now, there are distinctions, right? Korematsu was putting U.S. citizens in camps versus this case was denying entry to non-citizens. There are significant differences, right? But the optics are similar, right? You have basically a race or religion-based classification. And the dissenting opinion by Justice Sotomayor invoked Korematsu a few times. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the majority, and he upheld the travel ban. And he wrote about Korematsu. Let me read it to you. He says, finally, the dissent invokes Korematsu versus United States. Whatever rhetorical advantage the dissent may see in doing so, Korematsu has nothing to do with this case. The forcible relocation of U.S. citizens to concentration camps solely and explicitly on the basis of race is objectively unlawful and outside the scope of presidential authority. But it is wholly inapt to liken that morally repugnant order, Roosevelt's order, to a facially neutral policy, Trump's order, denying certain foreign nationals the privilege of admission. The dissent's reference to Korematsu, however, affords this court the opportunity to make express what is already obvious. Here's the key. Korematsu was gravely wrong. The date was decided. Has been overruled in the court of history. And to be clear, has no place in law under the Constitution. And here Roberts cites Justice Jackson in Youngstown. Again, he says, Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided, has been overruled in the court of history, and to be clear, has no place in law under the Constitution. So Braden, let me ask you this question, right? I just gave you the holding of the Supreme Court from not even a year ago. What does it mean for Korematsu to be overruled in the court of history? What is this a place I can visit? Do they have tours? I mean, can I file an appeal there? I don't know. Me neither. Nick?
People dislike it so much that they could never use that law to uphold.
Right. I think that's in the right track. So Dred Scott, which we haven't studied yet, but will, was never overruled. A 14th Amendment was ratified, which largely eliminated the decision, but was never formally overruled. I think Korematsu's in a similar boat. This stuff about the court of history is kind of silly. I don't know what the hell he's talking about, right? It's just, I was actually in the court when Roberts was announcing his opinion, and I was like, okay, they upheld the travel ban. Then he says, we overruled Korematsu. I'm like, whoa! I was like, whoa, it's got to happen. Like, we actually had to edit the video for Korematsu to add a scene at the end with that line. If you actually watch it, you'll see my voice sounds a little bit different because we recorded it 2 years apart. I didn't think Korematsu was going to change, but we recorded the first Korematsu video in 2017, and after 2018, we had to go back to the studio and had to re-record the ending. It's like, oh yeah, now it's overruled. But anyway, I think you said it right. You're not supposed to cite these cases, right? It's just you treat it as non-precedent. So Braden, what does Korematsu mean? I think it's a lesson of what not to do, right? That in certain times of war, you can't give blind deference. But what exactly that translates to is a hard question.
But it's still good law.
I would not cite it if I were you, my friend. If you're going to go start citing Korematsu in a brief, I think you're going to be in trouble. Right? I think you're going to be in a bad place.
If you were to go to war again, just like then, you think circumstances, they'd be like, here's a blank check.
Your loaded gun, right? Look, that's Scalia's point, right? I know it's awesome to say we would never do this again, but I don't, people do stuff, and they do stuff for reasons that aren't always, we don't always agree with. And I don't like making judgments on human behavior and what they'll do, predictions. I'm not very good at that, but I'm with Scalia on this one. Yes, Ruben?
So,
oh, Josh. Yeah, that's fine.
Question. Maybe I just kind of missed it or took it in the wrong way, but in Ex parte Endo, how exactly were they coming to the conclusion that the detention centers were not legal? Was it because the way I got it was that it wasn't expressed by?
Yeah, that's basically the answer. Had Congress wanted to give the president the power to do something so bold as creating camps for U.S. citizens, they would have done so expressly. And because they didn't do so expressly, we were going to say it goes too far.
So how does that come into play? Doesn't that kind of just do away with the entire implied aspect?
Right, and this is why I use the analogy that the Scalia line that Congress does not fit elephants in mouse holes, right? In other words, Congress can imply curfews, that's okay. And Congress can imply exclusion, that's okay. But it can't imply building camps and keep people there for years. Again, Korematsu is only about March 24th of 1942, just one day in history, right? Can they have this exclusionary order? Oh, yeah, that's permissible. But the 2 years subsequent, that goes too far. So if you limit Korematsu to just this poster, and it's all you're considering, it's not an insane holding. But it's about the scope of what the delegation is. I think Ruben and then Josh, Fusto.
So, how did the government determine if you were, like, you had Japanese ancestry, there was no blood test? I mean,
The census.
Okay.
The census was used, and also they sort of looked at people. I mean, it sort of sounds gross, but they would see naturalization records. There are different government documents of where people came from, where they're at. They figured it out. Oops, thank you.
So did other, Asian ethnic backgrounds?
I think it was only Japanese. There were policies for Germans and Italians, but on a much smaller scale, as well. Yeah, Fosa?
Clarification, the curfew and evacuation program are two different.
There are three elements of the same policy, right? Hirabayashi is only the curfew. Korematsu is only the exclusion. And Endo is only the detention, right? They were all from the same order, but the court broke up into three cases in that fashion. Hirabayashi was 43 for the curfew. The next year was 44 with Korematsu and exclusion. I'm sorry, detention. And then Endo was also 44 for the camps. That make sense?
I asked that because Douglas Endo indicated that implied powers must meet the purpose
Yes.
of the actual program, which is why detention camps didn't meet the purpose. So I was wondering how the curfew met the purpose. So I thought that maybe it must be two different.
Okay, so his question was, how does curfew, how does the curfew fit within the purpose but not the camps? Again, the curfew was a short-term measure. It says, look, just for some period of time, you have to stay in your homes, right? That's a burden, but not unreasonable. The third one, you have to go to a camp for 2 years. Okay, that's a bigger deal, right? So it's, how big of an elephant are you trying to squeeze into that mouse hole? It's not a bright line rule, but sort of how big of a deal is this before you say it goes too far? Yes, ma'am. If there was a war declaration, yeah. I mean, in New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, there were some pretty strict conditions on the people where curfews were imposed. The police went door-to-door searching houses. They didn't have search warrants. They confiscated firearms from people. They demanded people turn over their guns. If you want to see what Korematsu would look like in the modern era, go to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. I saw a hand somewhere there.
I was just saying, Houston had curfews for a couple of hurricanes.
After Harvey. Yeah, I think right here in Houston, right? I think those curfews were more to keep people off the streets, prevent people dying in floods, because you can't really see water at night. But yeah, that happens.
So as far as concentration camps, like putting people behind
Well, I mean, are you putting them there after some sort of proceeding or trial or allegation of guilt, or merely based on their race? Look, if Congress were to enact again the Concentration Act of 1944, I think the court would have said that's fine. Maybe not. I don't know. Who knows? But based on the reasoning here, they don't suggest there's a constitutional problem. You want to ask something? You sure? Okay. Yes, sir.
What if they keep people while they're waiting to be heard at trial?
Well, I mean, that's called jail, right? Usually, most people who are arrested, but there's a trial coming up here with the people in these camps. There was no trial in sight, right? There was no end game. They were going to be there indefinitely. Chief Justice Roberts said it was, and I will never disagree with Chief Justice Roberts. Never, never. I have to. He is our God. Just wait till he presides at the trial for impeachment. Man, it's going to be lit. Oh my God, Lord help us. The self-importance. Oh my God, the egos in that chamber will just going to be have like a thermonuclear explosion. All right. Anything else on Endo? All right, we're short on time. I'll do Dames and Moore a little bit quickly because I don't know if I should assign this case. I go back and forth. I think it's useful because it shows how Youngstown's actually applied. Now again, in Youngstown, Justice Jackson wrote a concurrence. He was not the majority opinion. But over the decades after Youngstown, people started to think, this Jackson opinion is pretty good. I told you in class last week that William Rehnquist, the Chief Justice, was clerking the term Youngstown was decided. Then fast forward to Dames and Moore, Rehnquist had a law clerk named John Roberts, who's now our Chief Justice. So basically, you had three justices in the sort of line who were involved with this case. Dames and Moore arose out of the Iranian hostage crisis, which transpired in the late 1970s. Basically, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, in Iran, was occupied by the Iranian government, or terrorists, whoever you want to call it, right? Many U.S. citizens were being held hostage for almost 2 years. Eventually, the U.S. government worked out a resolution, and the details of that are not very important. But one of the conditions of the resolution was to try to end all the hostilities between the U.S. and Iran. The U.S. was like, look, we got our problems. Let's put all that stuff behind us. Let's move on. Now, one of the ways to end hostilities was to settle litigation, right? Imagine you were a U.S. business, right? You're the Dames and Moore company. And you have a judgment against the Iranian government. That is, they owed you money. They didn't pay. You want to collect. Generally, if you have a judgment that they're not paying, how do you collect? You go to court and you say, hey, Iran has some property in the United States. How about you put that for auction and give me the proceeds, right? That's how judgments work, right? If you owe someone money and they're not paying it, you can take their property and sell it at auction. So Dames and Moore was like, look, we got this judgment. We won. Like the Iranian government breached our contract. But as a consequence of the settlement with Iran, the government wiped out all the claims. The government said, that's nice. You have a claim against the government. Too bad, right? We don't want these conflicts. We want to settle things. We want things to be smooth. We don't want any sort of hostilities between the U.S. and the Iran. I mean, God forbid, right? We don't want any more lingering hostility. So instead, here's what you're going to do. We're going to create this pot of money. And we're going to put all this money inside of this pot. And if you have some judgment against Iran, you can put in a claim and request money from this pot. But it's not just for you, right? Everyone in the United States who gets a judgment against Iran goes to the same pot of money. And look, it's possible you might be owed $1 million, maybe you'll get a few $1,000s back. But we're all friends now, right? We have these great relations with Iran, and that's the conflict, right? By suspending the judgments, right? By wiping out the claims, you got pennies on the dollar, if anything, right? Whatever money you're going to get is less than what you were owed. So the Dames and Moore company goes to court and they sue Regan. It's not Reagan, it's Regan, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, Don Regan. Everyone thinks it's Reagan. It's spelled somewhere with the different names. And they say, look, you can't suspend these claims. Why? Congress never approved it, right? There was no Iranian Settlement Act of 1981 that authorized the suspension of claims, right? It's like there was no Concentration Act of 1944. There was no Iranian Settlement Act of 1981. So the company said, look, President Reagan and the Secretary of the Treasury, you can't do this. You don't have the power to do this, right? But the court upheld the suspension of the claims. Why? Justice Rehnquist applies Youngstown. And he walks through Youngstown. And he says, Justice Black wrote the majority opinion, and that's it. He doesn't talk about Black anymore. He basically ignores Black. And then for the rest of the discussion, he talks about Justice Robert Jackson, who was his boss at the time. It's got to be some poetic license in this, right? And Rehnquist says that there are these three tiers, right? And ultimately, the court finds that the Reagan actions are in the first tier, right? Now, the Chief Justice acknowledges there's no express authorization, right? There's no Iranian Suspension Act of 1981. There's no law that specifically gives the government the power to nullify these claims and these attachments. But the court doesn't require a strict statute that says exactly this. He says we can look to other laws that are relevant in the looser sense of indicating congressional acceptance. Again, you have these other statutes that are relevant in the looser sense of indicating congressional acceptance. And he says these statutes show a broad scope for executive action. So this is Youngstown Zone 1, but with a bit of a twist, right? It's not required to have a statute that says directly this. It's in the ballpark. This is sort of in tension with Endo, right? Endo says you can't have these broad policies based on generalized delegations. But here the court expands the first zone of Youngstown to basically bleed into the second one, right? The second one was, well, we're not really sure. Right? That was the zone of twilight. But here, this basically extends zone 1 and shrinks zone 2 quite a bit. After Dames and Moore, it's going to be very hard to fall into the third tier. Right? If we take Dames and Moore seriously, you can always find a statute. There's always some statute that's in the ballpark. And if it's in the ballpark, congressional action is sufficient. Moreover, the court says there's no disapproval, right? After President Reagan settled these claims, Congress said, okay, that's fine, we're okay with it, right? We're fine with it. So you see, by looking to sort of implied authorization, Martin's question at the outset, right? The implied authorization, you water down Youngstown. And I think when you water down the first tier, it becomes basically useless, right? If we say that there's implied authorization in a loose sense, who even cares, right? It doesn't really matter. So they give it a deferential review, and they uphold the power of the government to suspend and nullify these claims. I think I got everything. See, if I recite a case, it goes a little quicker, but because I know I'm looking for it. But that's the general gist of Dames and Moore. Okay. Questions on Dames and Moore? All right, let me summarize a bit. We only have 2 classes on executive power, right? We had the class on Tuesday, which, thank you, David, for your reminder. We were here on Tuesday, where we did Merriman and we did the Youngstown case. Those are cases where the government where the government lost. And the 2 cases today, or the 3 cases today, the government basically prevailed. They lost on the Endo one, but it was kind of a technicality. So you see different approaches to executive power. And ultimately, these cases boil down to what sort of deference is given. Right? Youngstown says if Congress and the President are on the same page, you have deference. And that's more or less where the court comes down. But how do you decide if they're on the same page? How much deference you give to whether Congress spoke to the specific question? I think you have some tensions between Endo and Dames and Moore. Our class on Tuesday is not here because it's Rosh Hashanah. Have a wonderful Jewish New Year. Yeah, a lot of cancellations. I'm sorry. It's just the dates didn't line up this semester for us. But we'll be back here next Thursday, the 11th. I'm sorry, class 11. It's on October 3rd. We'll be talking about the removal power and the appointment power. The readings are a bit long for that, so you actually have a full week to do it. So please come prepared for Morrison v. Olson and Noel Canning. Anything else? All right, I'll see you all later. I'll be in my office if you need to talk. Thank you so much.